Good morning. I'm Nancy Davenport. I'm a university librarian, and I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to this social justice lecture series. This is a series that the library has done for the last 6 years, and we are very pleased to be able to present community discussions that are anchored in scholarship. And it's the sort of thing that I think the universities and university libraries are particularly well poised to be able to do. I'm also honored to be able to introduce our speaker this morning. Marc Masurovsky is in fact an AU alum. He has his master's degree in history from American University, but he's been working on this topic for his career. Since the 1990s, there's been a renewed interest in and advocacy to document how between 1933 and 1945, Jews and other groups persecuted by the Nazis were dispossessed of their assets, and especially their cultural, artistic, and familial assets. Some of us were made more aware of this through a popular film a couple of years ago, Woman in Gold, partly because of the storyline, partly because of the actors who really brought that storyline to heart. And so I think there are people who are Helen Mirren fans who actually learned some of this for the first time. But the challenge since the 90s has been finding ways of doing justice to the victims of plunder and their families in a set of complex legal and ethical environment, oftentimes that pits museums, auction houses, governments against Jewish victims, their families, and their advocates. So to answer the question of where are we now, we have invited Marc Masurovsky, an historian based in Washington, D.C. He's the co-founder of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, known as HARP. He is a former director of research for the Presidential Advisory Commission on Holocaust-Era Assets from 1999 to 2000. And he's the co-author with Fabrizio Calvi of La Festin du Reich, published by Editions Fayard in 2006. And he received his MA in history from American University. Welcome back to campus, sir. We have seats up front. Easier if you go out in the hall and come back in the other door. Go ahead.
All right. I'm delighted to be back, because that's really what it is. I haven't been on campus in quite some time, but I do remember my years here fondly. They were a mix of tumult and a lot of creative energy. So, in any event, I kind of hesitated today about giving you a formal lecture or opening it up for discussion earlier than, at the end. So, in a certain sense, if you have something burning that you'd like to ask me, which it doesn't send us in too many side directions, I would urge you to ask. It's something you don't understand, or something you need to be clarified, or just feel free, because I want this to be mildly interactive. Otherwise, it's going to be a real romp through history, and there's a tremendous amount of ground to cover. So that's why I'm sort of hemming and hawing, but I'll give you somewhat of a hybrid. So the story starts today, and I hope to make it sort of a looped flashback. On November 26th, there will be an international conference in Berlin, Germany, to celebrate, quote unquote, the 20 years of what is referred to as the Washington Principles. These principles were enacted as a legal, non-binding document in December 1998 at a conference in Washington, which was supposed to sort of be a status check on where are we with regards to returning Holocaust assets, or at least to compensate victims of the Holocaust with regards to their material losses. I hope that in the next 40-45 minutes you will understand why I am deeply skeptical of these principles and why they haven't really worked for the claimants. They've really worked for the current possessors, or those who are currently holding works of art, objects of art, and the definition is large. It's not just your Tintorettos and your Renoirs and your Klimts and your Schillers, but we're talking also about books, we're talking about works on paper, sculpture, textiles, all sorts of accessories, decorative objects, so that includes furniture, It can include also ritual material used in Jewish ceremonies. Music, musical instruments. There were thousands of pianos, for instance, that were stolen during the war. I don't know if it's a German obsession or not, but in Paris alone, there was a gigantic warehouse filled with 8,000 pianos for people to come and try to pick up their piano. So the range is very broad, but you only hear about that little slice of art, which is sometimes referred to erroneously and very misleadingly as treasures and masterpieces. But not everybody in Europe was as rich and wealthy as the Rothschilds, the David Weils, the Bergmans, and etc. Most people were working class, middle class, and therefore what they owned was not necessarily an object that would go into a museum. But it was an object that was of sufficient aesthetic quality that it could be the subject of dispossession. So, our little story starts on January 1933. January 30th, to be more precise, when Hitler comes to power. So from a legal standpoint, and I will constantly go back and forth with regards to legal concepts, although I'm not a lawyer, so if anybody here is a lawyer, you can feel free to correct me. But from a legal standpoint, restitution cases do not start before 1933, and before that fateful date. So to give you just one little sliver of an example, George Gross, a German expressionist who basically went into exile in New York City and taught at the Art Students League. His studio was ransacked the night that Hitler came to power. His apartment was vandalized, and it is quite clear that if he had come to Berlin at that particular moment, he would have been killed. 3 months later, Albert Einstein was thinking of visiting his home in Germany, but he basically doubled back and stopped his trip because he found out through the grapevine that his house had been vandalized and all the art and all the objects in his house had been removed. In March, April, May, the first forced sales take place. Now, forced sale, and nobody still agrees on this definition because nobody really wants to define it. Forced sale is when you, as a member of the Jewish community, have no other option but to sell. It's not because there's economic hardship around you. No, economic hardship that's there is a direct consequence of the state-sanctioned policy of persecution because you are a Jew. So the first people to get fired from their jobs are art historians. And the second layer are curators. So the attack of the National Socialist government is directly aimed at the art world. Make no mistake about this. From day one, art is the intended victim, aside from the fact that Jews are ideologically targeted. So our issue of Plunder starts on January 30th, 1933, no questions asked. So as the events unfold over the next months, we get to 1934, the Reich Chamber of Culture is put into place, and that is basically a screening mechanism to prevent Jews who are artists, intellectuals, anyone who's a practitioner of the arts, but again, writ large, we're talking about art teachers, we're talking about musicians, sculptors, writers, whatever. They will be banned from their professions because they need a certificate from the Reich Chamber of Culture. So that is the first official start of the marginalization of the entire sort of Jewish intellectual world, if you want, practicing the fine arts or any artistic activity. And gradually they will be forced either into exile or they will be forced into so-called internal exile, finding some rural town somewhere to hide out in until the inevitable happens. Or they will be protected by friends who are non-Jewish and they will work in factories. Or they will be basically informally ghettoized where they can only teach other Jews. So that is the Jewish context in the art world as it's developed. The so-called process of Arionization, where a Jewish business is transferred to a non-Jewish entity, starts also very early. starts actually in the spring of 1933, and the first victim of this is the Fleckheim Gallery. The Fleckheim Gallery had a branch in Düsseldorf and in Berlin, and Mr. Fleckheim was one of the pioneers, if you want, of and advocates, leading advocates of German Expressionism, anything that was sort of in the vanguard of expression during the Weimar years in Germany. He was also the Jew that everybody loved to hate. Because of his physiognomy, he fit perfectly into anti-Semitic stereotypes. So you can basically call Mr. and Mrs. Google, and you will find tons of satirical portraits of Mr. Fleckheim as the eternal Jew. He is forced to flee because of these circumstances and goes to London. The Arionization is actually a casual one because the system of Arionization was not put into place, but the takeover of his gallery by his assistant, Mr. Vermel, was sanctioned by the local Nazi party. So it basically fits into the construct of an Arionization. It was sort of wild, but it was recognized, and Mr. Vermel's ownership was never questioned. All the cases involving Mr. Fleckheim's property are still haunting us today. There are a multitude of cases between Germany and the United States that involve items once owned by Mr. Fleckheim. The Gross case against the Museum of Modern Art places Mr. Fleckheim as a second piece. And this case basically took place, I think, in 2009. And it pitted the heirs of Mr. Gross against the Museum of Modern Art because the Gross heirs found 3 paintings belonging to George Gross. And the key was, did George Gross sell the paintings to Mr. Fleckheim, or was he dispossessed when Mr. Fleckheim was forced to flee and subsequently taken over by Mr. Vermel? So that was at the heart of the case. The problem is, and we'll see a little later, the case was lost by the heirs for all sorts of complicated legal and strategic reasons that I would basically put the onus on the plaintiffs as much as on the defense. So in a certain sense, I want you to understand how history and its miscarriages have basically led to decades of litigation. Yes, sir?
Was George Gross Jewish?
No. But he was a prime target of the Nazis because of his endless satirical approaches.
So I think maybe we should also mention communists.
Yes, also.
As being
absolutely
big targets of
right.
Nazis.
No, I fully agree. And communist artists as well, socialist artists. So politics played a definite role in this, and I'm glad that you pointed this out, because in terms of your fate, let's say as an anti-fascist or an anti-Nazi activist through your art, your fate, relatively speaking, although it was pretty bad, was not as severe as if you were Jewish. And this is something that develops over time, although the first victims, if you want, that go into the first concentration camps are not Jews, but they're political opponents and priests. So anywhere from the Catholic center all the way to the extreme left, you will find these people incarcerated in a sort of a loose network of prisons and camps and torture centers established in Germany until the camp system itself sort of gets refined. So thank you for pointing that out. All right, so back to our bailiwick. So remember, as I put you through this, we're talking about very gradual, it's not sudden. The only thing that is consistent about the Nazis is that they're going after the cultural sphere from the first day to the last day. This is part of Hitler's obsession. It's summarized in, I think, the 23rd principle of the Nazi program of revamping and overhauling the entire artistic and cultural sphere. To get rid of, and I'll spare you all the epithets, but some of the more colorful ones are pornographic, occult, Masonic, perverse, whatever, to characterize what the old order was. It's sort of the typical Nazi tendency to transform the opponents into creatures, something that we saw in Rwanda, for instance, the Hutus against the Tutsis. Hutus calling Tutsis cockroaches, so it's not so far from Jews being referred to as rats in varmint. And this theme just goes along for 12 years. All right, 1935, the Nuremberg Principles are enacted. Now, it's an important issue here because the Nuremberg Principles codify what is a Jew, and therefore sort of enshrine the process of marginalization, segregation of Jews from most professions, if not all. You need specific exemptions to be able to continue to work under very strict circumstances. It also means that exits are becoming more difficult. The establishment of Reich taxes, flight taxes as they're referred to, penalizing Jews and most of their property in exchange for the safe conduct to leave the country. So essentially, they only had their clothes on their backs and a little suitcase, which is still subject to searches. So the idea of smuggling art out of Germany becomes very difficult as of the enactment of those principles. Now, if you fast forward to the 90s, when American museums were faced with the idea that they might be harboring loot, they were trying to figure out when the clock starts. And this is, I don't even know if it's comical, but to ask the museum community to start ruling about National Socialism is a little bit difficult. So, bottom line, they were fretting over starting in 1933. Remember, this is when forced sales begin. 1935 was the earliest possible, and if so, they wanted to push the date further up to 1937. Nothing consequential happens in 1937, so I'm still not clear why 1937 was ever invoked. This shows a little bit sort of the confusion that was reigning and sort of the embarrassment that was reigning in the museum community. Instead of basically sitting down and having an honest conversation about history as it relates to their acquisitions, they were sort of hemming and hawing about when the clock starts. Well, nobody set this clock. History set that clock. It starts on January 30th, 1933. In any event, let's proceed. I can't go into all the details of what happens in the Third Reich because then we'll have to bring costs. But it's important to know dispossession occurs, Arionization occurs, seizures occur, requisitions, sequestration, all those lovely words occur, and they have one thing in common. The loss of property against your consent. That's very important, because when you face a judge in the 90s and even today, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you were dispossessed without your consent. So again, history is basically adjudicated in a courtroom by, and I'm not trying to disparage judges, but it's not really their job to basically sort out history, especially when it's that complicated. Perhaps it's because of the lack of experts. I don't think so. There are thousands of people who teach and study the Holocaust and the Third Reich. So let's move on. The purges in museums in Germany are accelerating. In other words, everything that is objectionable to the Nazi government is being removed from German museums. So that's another layer of dispossession, but it's a state-sanctioned dispossession against state cultural institutions. Remember, private museums are an exception in most European countries, which is still true today, although there are more and more private museums, but they still represent a fraction of cultural activity. So the state goes against its own cultural institutions and disgorges these objects. And at one point, it will be a little later, 4 dealers, German art dealers, not Jewish, of course, will be designated by Mr. Goebbels, the Mr. of Enlightenment, to essentially dispose of most of this disgorged property. Now, if you're an art dealer and somebody shows up at your door and says, have I got a deal for you, 20,000 items that need to be somewhat gotten rid of because we realize that rather than burning them, we're going to be pragmatic and we're going to try to make money off of them. So some of these are actually defined as examples of modern art that was housed in German museums. And of course, these 4 dealers are delighted. They're not even questioning it for a second. You may have heard of one of them. His name is Gerlich. The Gerlich case basically hit us broadside 5 years ago. Another one is Mr. Buchholz. Mr. Buchholz basically showed up in New York in 1935 with a suitcase filled with we don't know what, and opened a gallery and basically started selling German expressionists. That's a funny coincidence, wouldn't you think? So thanks to those dealers, the contamination begins in the international art market, because of course you can't sell these items in Germany, which is being subject to what we refer to, at least the Allies refer to it as internal plunder. External plunder begins when you start invading other countries. So these items are leaving Germany under different kinds of auspices. But remember one thing also about the forced sales. They have to take place somewhere. And they take place in auction houses. They also take place in galleries. They also sometimes occur in a sort of more roguish fashion. So in a warehouse or in a storage company, where the Nazis just open crates and then they essentially refer to them as, house sales. They actually take place even in apartments. There, you can find photos at the U.S. Holocaust Museum where there's a kid brandishing an umbrella because he just bought it. So everything is up for grabs. Everything, including the fixtures. The Jewish apartments and residences are being emptied systematically. Now that means now that the auction market is complicit in the crimes committed by the Nazis. They are basically part and parcel of the mechanics. We also have art dealers now who have basically thrown their lot. Remember, all this is based on choices. You can do it, or you don't have to do it. If you're not a Jew, it's not going to cost you much if you say, no, I don't want to sell this stuff. Of course, you might get a little roughed up, or you might have to leave, but you're not going to lose your life. So there's a tremendous amount of institutional opportunism that takes over. And this is a kind of human behavior that is, in my book anyway, it's rather reprehensible, but you need that in order to pursue your program. Yes?
Finish your sentence.
That's it.
I'm sorry. So early on, there's this complicity. Let's say complicity in 5 years, complicity in 10 years. But at some point, if you get far enough down the line and there have more and more transactions, there's what you might call good faith purchasers, right?
Okay.
That they have. How do you deal with that?
Okay. Well, it's going to materialize. But it's one of the stinging questions of the day. Is how do you deal basically with good faith purchasers? In other words, people who basically plead that they knew absolutely nothing of the crimes surrounding the object that they bought. And then the only available answer is, did you do your research? There is something in the art market called due diligence. And it's supposedly something that you're supposed to practice on a daily basis, but it appears to be a haphazard incidental practice. At least it was so until 1998. Yes?
So a question about the internal plunder case, in terms of the German museum selling their collection internationally. So now do the German museums want what was in their museum back?
It's a very good logical question. I'm not laughing because it's a funny question. I'm happy that you actually raised it. It's actually a thorn in everybody's side. Not to sidetrack too much, but it's not the German museum selling abroad. It's basically these dealers selling what has already left the collections. In May 1938, the deaccessioning law is passed officially. So all the deaccessions prior to 1938 are essentially grandfathered in, and they're authorized, and it continues way into the early 40s. Fast forward to liberation, the surrender of Germany. American officials in the U.S. zone of occupation of Germany, that's Bavaria, are trying to figure out what to do with these objects, especially the ones that were disgorged from German museums. And the deaccession law is the only law that I know, as far as I'm concerned, that was passed by the Nazis, that was upheld by the Americans. Now, it's an interesting logic that stimulated it, because by that time, by 1947-48, thousands of these objects had entered private and public collections, both in Western Europe, but mostly in the United States. In other words, you had a lot of buyers coming, sending cutouts, or basically coming themselves personally and buying these objects from the dealers, the acknowledged dealers. There were a number of spectacular sales that took place, one particularly in Lucerne, Switzerland, in June 1939, which is supposed to gather together the cream of the crop from these German museums. And you had leading paintings by Matisse, Gauguin, and many others that have found their way at MoMA, at the St. Louis Museum, at the Guggenheim. So they're a little bit everywhere. So basically, repatriating those paintings back to German museums, because that's what it is. It's a state institution that loses its property. It's being privately discussed by a number of German museum directors these days, but it is such a sensitive topic, it automatically becomes an international problem. Because that means that you have to ask all these museums, especially in the West, to disgorge. And that means that you have to check, you have to correct something that was decided by your own government in 1947, 1948, which was a tremendously misguided decision. But it's just that they didn't want to deal with it. And anyway, when you read what the American officers had to say about it, they say, well, I would have done the same thing because you don't want indecent art to be in museums. So that's the mood, you know. But let's go back to our little fish. The main dates after this are essentially July 37 in Munich. There's a failed, well, with 20/20 hindsight, there's a failure. The Nazi government wants to introduce the German public to degenerate art. That's what it's called, entactete Kunst. And they want to sort of put side by side the degenerate art with what they consider to be proper art. So I urge you to go and YouTube your way into it. There's some lovely newsreels showing the public viewing these works. And I ask you to please focus on people's faces as they look at the art. It's not horror. It's interest. At least that's the way I would describe it. Nobody's going, you know, it's not, nobody's cringing, but everybody's fascinated. So that's why I'm calling it a failure, because ultimately it was introducing the German public to things that, you know, well, actually are curious and interesting from an aesthetic viewpoint. Anyway, so that exhibit basically, you know, horrified people around the world, and it reminded the international community once again about the Nazis and their evil doings. An exhibit to retaliate to that exhibit takes place in London in 1938, organized by the Leicester Galleries, that promotes German expression and art. But that art basically is being sent there by artists, you know, at the risk of their lives, by dealers representing them, and by private collectors both in Germany, in Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. So that exhibit gets put together, and that's an entirely different story, but it's something that you might want to do research on because there's still a question as to where those pieces ended up. But nevertheless, it was quite a remarkable exhibit, but the British public was not really warm to, you know, avant-garde art, so it met with a generally cool reception. However, it is a standout because it was one of the most important early exhibits after the Nazis come to power of degenerate works. Let's not forget the Anschluss, March 1938, the great Nazi march into Austria, greeted with open arms. The Nazis had 5 years to rehearse, you know, what they were doing to the Jews, so by the time they get into Austria, their campaign is brutal, violent from day one. There are horrible scenes of women wearing fur coats on their hands and knees with toothbrushes scrubbing the sidewalks. The Gestapo and their, you know, and other agents of German agencies basically barge into people's homes, rich, poor, and looking for gold because Jews basically harbor gold. So the number of shakedowns and you know, torture sessions taking place inside apartments are more than you want to imagine, and of course the art gets requisitioned, and this is important. And this is the woman in gold. So that's where that story begins, basically. So by then, also Arionization is in full-blown mode. The idea of a Jewish census basically is tested in Austria, so Jews have to register their property. So this begins in April, May 1938. Those documents can be researched to the public, and you can, as long as you want to go to Vienna. And they're sort of a testament to the venality, if you want, of the Nazis and what they were looking for. Because again, the crime itself is also a crime against people, but it really is a crime against property. It's a crime of dispossession, because it's founded in the thesis that Jews are not allowed to own property. So therefore, everything that they possess belongs to the Nazi state. And that's the logic. Yes?
I recently read that before 1939 there were over 200,000 Jews living in Vienna, and by 1945 there were 127.
No, they're more than that, but basically, you know, the Austrian Jews were trapped. So they only had a couple of limited exits. They went east, they went west, or they went north. But invariably, those who could get away, which are the wealthier, again, and this is a scenario that repeats itself everywhere, were able to go to England, to the Netherlands. Well, if they went to the Netherlands, then they got caught after when the Nazis invaded. If they go to Hungary, they tried to go to Hungary, but the quota against for Jews was so limited that the gates basically closed rather quickly. And the only other exit was going south. So many Austrian Jews end up in Italy. Trieste is sort of a major drop-off point, and then hopefully they can catch a ship and go either to Palestine or to the Americas. Lisbon eventually will be one of the key centers through which refugees were able to get out of Nazi or Axis-occupied territories, will venture and take the so-called Pan Am Clipper to New York. London is also a privileged landing point. You heard the stories of the Kinder transports. So there are channels through which Jews can basically travel, but again, those gates are going to close quickly. So we have the Anschluss, and so we have November 1938, Kristallnacht. Now, Kristallnacht was an event that was sort of waiting to happen. In other words, the Nazis were disgracing, and they figured that you know, any pretext was good. So of course, this officer in Paris, this German officer, gets shot in Paris by a Jewish refugee who's you know, who's not exactly in his right spirits, but basically this is all you could find to do, and that is a trigger mechanism to the sacking and burning of 1,000 synagogues and the internment of 10,000 Jews. Now, what's remarkable about this event is that the Nazis basically sat down on the eve of the event with German art dealers and German museum directors and discussed how to share the plunder. So in other words, it's premeditation on the cultural side. They were expecting thefts, and they basically took advantage of Kristallnacht to empty wealthy Jewish collections. The dealers in Munich are especially guilty of this, and one of them, Mr. Scheidwimmer, is the one who recycled this painting, which is now in contention at the Arionization Museum in Madrid. It's a Pissarro painting, which the Spaniards, I'm sorry to say, will probably never return. So it's sort of a thankless battle, unless you can attack sort of larger principles. Anyway, so that's the romp through Europe. I'm sorry, we are sort of a fast forward, but it's just to give you a sense as to what's going on. Now, before I do move on, I just want you to remember one thing. The border, the German border is still open. And this has been documented by established historians, where there's still exchanges between American universities and German universities. You have American professors going to German universities and attending Nazi rallies. You know, it's business as usual. And also you have a lot of American businessmen, but also British businessmen, who go to Germany and attend the sales. And the Swiss do also. So this one particular sale, the Glaser sale, which took place in June 1933 in Berlin, essentially is the groundwork for a major restitution case that is still unfolding, because Mr. Glaser was a leading art historian. He lost everything, several hundred, mostly works on paper. And the Basel Museum basically purchased 110 or 120 of them. They've refused to return any of them, while a court in Hanover basically ruled on the same case and realized that it was a forced sale, and agreed to the fact that it was a forced sale, and returned 3 items to the Glaser family. So what I'm trying to introduce to you right here is that the same historical event gets interpreted in completely opposite ways. A forced sale may not be a forced sale for the Swiss, but the Swiss really don't care, because they basically hide under the cloak of good faith. These are all civil code violations, so therefore there is no exceptional statute dealing with Holocaust issues or plunder or objects being displaced during mass events such as genocide, ethnocide, and what have you. So this is a problem, the lingering problem in Switzerland, and it's been lingering since 1949. So So that's part of the picture. So every single event that I'm telling you has legal repercussions today. And it has generated a handful of lawsuits. I mean, there could be more, but it's just because nobody can afford these lawsuits. So it's only for the wealthy to basically file suits. The external plunder, let's just go through this quickly, takes place in all the occupied territories that the German army occupies. And with the German army, you have an organization called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or Rosenberg Task Force, or ERR. So again, if you want to do quick research, go to Google and you'll see it. The database that I manage basically deals with the plunder produced by the ERR in France, Belgium, and Netherlands. So every country that gets occupied gets plundered. It's very simple. Every one of them. Now, by the time the war ends, you have to be there, the balance sheet is still unknown. There was never an audit. Nobody actually sat down to try to figure out exactly what was lost and what was recovered and what's still out there. So that exercise, so 1945, is still lacking. The focus has always been on objects of museum quality. Now, as I told you earlier, not everybody owns museum quality items. And even if it is a museum quality item, do we have to go by the standards of the Metropolitan Museum, the Tate, the National Gallery of London, or do we accept the standards of a small municipal museum in central France or a regional museum in the Czech Republic? So whose standard, whose norm, whose aesthetic criteria are we going to accept? And for whatever it's worth, I refuse to pronounce their name, the monuments people, established this enshrined, if you want, for the record, that only items of museum quality read the Western canon were objects that interested them. And so that's what they focused on in their zones of occupation after 1945. So our cultural advisors, who came from the leading art museums and art history departments in the United States, came to Germany not knowing what Mr. Nussbaum did, not knowing what Mr. Soutine did, not knowing about Mr. Fleckheim, very little about George Gross, although they probably might have bumped into him in New York City. But he doesn't compare to Tintoretto. So you have a negative confluence of aesthetic prejudices meeting with the problem of justice for trying to recover objects that were plundered. And that has haunted us ever since then. Allied policy was completely misguided and essentially focused on those objects because presumably they were the easier ones to identify. But that was sort of giving short shrift to 95% of the victims because, of course, they were not lawyered up, they didn't have accounts, they didn't have inventories drawn up, you know, by their insurance people, their assessors, and their advisors. No, they didn't have that arsenal. So, of course, they would have taken a little bit more effort to research it. But that effort was not desired and not desirable because the clock was ticking in the Allied zones of occupation, and especially because the American army did not want to be in the business of restitution. So if there's anything that I want you to remember today, is definitions. Restitution is an act of physical return to the person. In other words, you lose your Tintoretto, you lose your Nussbaum, you lose your Soutine, I find it, and it gets returned to you. That's restitution. Repatriation is not restitution. It is simply sending a crate of objects from one country to another and requiring that country to basically restitute to its citizens who have survived the war and who are the rightful owners. Replacement is a policy that was favored by most of the Western European nations, not by the Americans, and also by the Soviets, to essentially go to Germany and Austria and find something of equal value and importance to the objects that you could not locate yourself. So by 1949, 1950, you have all these teams of Dutch, Belgian, French showing up in German collections, public and private, Austrian, public and private, and basically saying, we want that Boucher painting. I want that Van Ostad. Actually, he's Dutch, so he belongs in the Netherlands. So you have this kind of silly, opportunistic reasoning that essentially deprives legitimate owners in Germany and Austria of their property. No questions asked. Part of those works of art are now subject to all sorts of legal entanglements because they are in the custody of these governments. They have been put in odd categories. In France, they're called the MNRs, Musées Nationaux Récupération. That means National Museums Recovery. Récupération is sort of an ambiguous French term. It can go in all directions. But essentially, they recovered those works and placed them in state collections. The Dutch have the NK collection, which is exactly the same. And recently, the same problem arose in Belgium, where there are at least 700 paintings that were identified as fitting in that limbo land. It just simply means that the governments are willing to wait for claimants to show up and then consider their claims. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to return. So, restitution, in other words, a return in kind of the object. It's a short-lived moment, 1945 to 1947. After 1947, we turn to compensation schemes. So therefore, if you wake up from your shock and the trauma of the war, and don't know that there were laws put into place in France, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, Austria, which was still under Allied occupation, then too bad, you know? Then you have to file a claim with the compensation office. So the struggle for restitution actually really begins in 1947, because once these owners realize that the window is closed, then they're going to have to push. But so many of them can't push because they don't have the energy to push. And the worst part of it is that the Jewish groups that were supposed to basically support them are not supporting restitution, but rather they're supporting compensation schemes because it's just easier, you know, to negotiate, get a pile of money, and then basically spread it to needy survivors. There's nothing wrong with that, except that that policy was put into place at the expense of the physical return of the objects. And you have sort of surrealistic scenes where you have Jewish groups selling cultural property, saying that it's heirless, when in fact the heir was not too far away. And then when the heir is called, you know, let's say the JRSO or whoever, they say, well, too bad, you know, too late. Yes?
Isn't that the case also, in addition to what you're saying, that that at this point in time, when the heirs have probably died, I mean, the original owners have died, and the heirs received no paper documents or even photos, because all of that was destroyed as well, that memory is being asked to suffice for documents, and family members are fighting among themselves.
Okay, well that's, yeah, that's...
Even in the Jewish
I know.
museum have
Okay.
tons of...
The problem is, there are obviously, when you basically file a claim, and I'm not going to, unfortunately, you know, same thing, we just could be here. It's an extended discussion, but the gist of it is, it's harrowing enough to file a claim, especially when you're first and second generation. Third generation is very removed from the event and is producing its own complications. But the idea is that you want your property back, not because you want to make money, but because it is the only thing left of your family. And it's still true today, and it'll be true tomorrow, and it'll be true next year. So the restitution issue is not a momentary problem. It's one that's anchored in loss and trauma. And this is something that you cannot sit and explain to a museum and to an auction house and to a gallery and to a state cultural institution or government. It is something that is deep inside you and is the only reminder of what once was. And that's the traumatic aspect of restitution, which explains why a lot of people did not file restitution claims, because they were just absolutely, that's it. Turn the page, we're done. And I don't blame them. So 1950 basically to today, or at least to 1998, but it is still today, compensation is the word, restitution is a bad thing. Or it's too complicated. But nevertheless, there were restitution cases taking place in the United States, for instance. They start as of 1949, more or less. And the one that I'm referring to is one of the Martin Oaks in Washington. There was a German Jew who basically found his wooden medieval piece and asked, I guess it was Harvard, to return it. And Harvard said, take a hike. And the State Department supported Harvard. So that was the end of that one. But legally speaking, it was an important moment because this claimant was trying to apply principles that had been passed in the US zone of occupation called Military Law 59, which essentially was designed to turn the tables on current possessors and tell them, if you basically cannot prove that you bought this in good faith, you lose your object. It's an interesting problematic, but it was short-lived, but I think, at least on the part of the US military, it was a good faith effort at that particular point to try to right the wrongs. So let's look at the balance sheet. We're talking about millions, if not tens of millions of objects that have changed hands. We're talking about, what, 15 countries at the very least that were affected. And I'm not even talking about Asia at this point, because the Chinese mainland was basically subject to the same depredations as the European continent, but that's not something that we talk about. So plunder is a crime against humanity. And it's a crime that was enshrined at the Nuremberg trials of 1946. But it's the only crime that was forgotten. I can understand why it might have been forgotten, because you want to focus on the people. But if you only focus on the people at the expense of their material losses, then all you're doing is rewriting the rules about Nazism. Because Nazism was anchored in vast resentment of Jews for what they owned and what they were. So if you deny the fact that their ownership of objects is subsidiary, then you're sort of putting yourself in a position where you're being more righteous than the righteous. And you're saying, well, I know what's best for you. I want to focus on your losses, the spiritual losses, the physical losses. But of course you want to. But don't denigrate the fact that you had all of this environment around you in which you thrived and which was really the enrichment part of your life, spiritually and materially. And by denying that, you're essentially rewriting history. I'm sorry. So this is where we are today. Basically, the door reopened in 1995, 1996. 1995, there was a big conference at Fayard in New York City. They had a center there, and it was supposed to deal with where are we today with regards to state losses. So they invited all the former antagonists, put them around the table, they had historians and everything else. It was a signal moment. It was called the Spoils of War Conference. In fact, you can find the publication. It's actually well done. And they have a newsletter that they put out occasionally, at least. It used to be active. And it tracks state losses and the whole debate about state losses, which is all about international law and the whole concept of cultural property. But of course, the Jews were not part of that conversation. About a year later, the Swiss bank crisis invades our consciousness. And it started simply because Mr. Bronfman went to Switzerland to inquire about whether it was true that the Swiss bankers had actually misused accounts that were once owned by Jews. And the Swiss bankers told him to go to hell. And Mr. Bronfman didn't like anybody to tell him to go to hell. So he came back to New York, called Mr. D'Amato, who was also looking for a pretext to deflect from the attention he was getting regarding corrupt activities in Long Island. And he went full hog and said, yeah, we're going to take them on. And actually, to D'Amato's credit, he did an amazing job. So all of a sudden, we have hearings taking place at the Senate Banking Committee, dragging the Swiss to the table, or at least their legal representatives, and forcing them to answer questions about what they did between 1933, well, as of 1933, because the mischief went way beyond 1945. I mean, they just simply never bothered to check whether there was a legitimate owner to any of these accounts with Jewish sounding names. I basically participated in one of these lawsuits, and I can tell you that the figures are staggering, but the settlements were paltry. We basically recommended that 10 billion should be the very minimum you should ask the Swiss to disgorge, but they settled for 1.25. That's why, class action lawsuits has their upsides and downsides. But this was sort of the signal that public policy was failing the claimants and the victims of Nazism, and especially the victims of plunder. And the lawyers were basically entering the field. Nothing wrong about being a lawyer, but essentially, when the government basically takes a back seat and says, I don't want to get involved in this, well, it's an opportunity. So, and there were some really, and there are still very decent lawyers who are essentially representing claimants, but it is not really their job to write history, because that history is getting rewritten lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And that's not their job, it's the job of historians, really. But unfortunately, the historians are not there to write really the true story, the complex story of plunder. And I still don't understand it. Even our memorial institutions in this country and also in Europe don't really address the topic. So you have to wonder whether there is a stigma associated with saying you're Jewish, a victim, and talking about your material losses. And I don't have an answer for that, except if there is an answer, it's a stale one. Yes?
And so I'm afraid I'm going to have to push back just a little, because I am a lawyer.
Please do.
And I'm a lawyer for the government.
Okay.
And there have been a number of cases since the early 1990s where the government has actually gone and seized a stolen item.
I'm not talking about that. But thank you for mentioning it.
Well, but as they, private collections, as they try and sell something from that, the law has a 5-year date of discovery. The government, it's a remedy. The government can take action against that stolen property, and we have, and returned it to the owners, or the claimants, the true claimants. We've also recovered stolen property and dealt with auction houses who paid the good faith purchaser the money for the stolen item and returned it to the true owner. So I'm just, there's other remedies that aren't getting mentioned
No,
here.
because but thanks for opening that up. There are various options. Either the one that you're mentioning is makes the United States one of the rare jurisdictions in the world where you can actually come and recover your property and you don't have to be a citizen. The National Stolen Property Act was passed, I think, in 1934, and is really the bedrock legislation that allows the U.S. government to essentially look at stolen property as something that was converted on U.S. territory when it enters the market, meaning that it is passed off as what it's not, and is sold. In fact, most cases in the U.S. are about conversion. Property that's basically resold on the U.S. market that is actually looted. So you can't sell stolen property in the U.S. That's plain and simple. We're one of the rare countries where we actually enshrine that principle. The problem in Europe is that a thief can basically get good title. And the years that it takes to do this can vary between 3, 5, and 10, depending on which country you're in. So in other words, if you have stolen property in Europe as a result of the war, and you say nothing, you basically act innocent, and no claim comes your way, then you're basically free and clear after a certain period of time. So theft actually is a business opportunity when it comes to looted property. In the United States, it is complicated simply because we do have a sound criminal code that deals with this, but the problem is the pushback from the museums. And the pushback, I'm sure you know about this, obviously, the legal defenses go anywhere from what's referred to as latches. Where were you when we had an exhibit in 1962? Because you should have known about the painting being there. There was a statute of limitations. Every state has one. So is that enforceable? Is it not? You have rules of discovery. You have rules of when you actually know that the work is there, then that so-called bell rings. And this is the Gross case. When Mr. Gross saw his paintings at MoMA, that eventually is what killed the case, because he did nothing to claim his paintings. So the 3-year statute ran out, and MoMA technically, legally, was in the clear. You can argue all sorts of contextual issues, but that's why I said it was kind of mishandled on both sides. The legal part of it is really an entanglement, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but I think what you're referring to in part is the weapon that the US government holds to basically short-circuit all these complexities and to declare something, and to basically make it criminal. Because in a certain sense, that's what we've been trying to do for the last 2 decades, is transform these cases, taking them out of the civil courts and make them into a criminal count. So that gets ICE, that gets FBI, that gets basically law enforcement involved, which is what facilitates the seizures.
We don't have to go criminal, and I am referring to ICE, and it is a civil forfeiture, seizure and forfeiture, except we usually don't go to forfeiture. We just do sort of an interpleader, have the claimants kind of show true ownership and release to the true owner.
That's a case of forfeiture, but I'm not going to get into that part of it. It's the portrait of Walle case, which took, yes?
In an ideal world, if people, museums or whoever possesses these things offered them forward, they were able to identify it. Is there a kind of a list against, a big enough list or database that people could even come forward anyway?
No. No, I mean, the one that I have is, has 40,000 items in it, and it's growing every day, but we're basically doing the job of the French government, so they should have put together this database 10 years ago. So the short answer is no, and that's one of the failures of the Washington Principles, is that there was no central registry ever built, which is one of the principles suggesting that that should be done. It never got done. The Walle case, and I don't want you to leave it here it is. The Walle case starts basically in late fall 1997. There's a gigantic retrospective of the works of Egon Schiele that comes to the Museum of Modern Art because Mr. Lauder, who was the chairman of the board at the time, was, he had been ambassador to Austria, therefore he has a huge liking for Schiele's and Klint's, and because of his relationship with the gallery that basically owned the largest collection of Schiele's in the world, the Leopold Foundation, he essentially convinces them to bring the exhibit to New York. A number of things happened that made the seizure possible, but basically the claimants woke up and realized that their painting, Walle, did not have the right provenance, so they contacted the MoMA, and they asked them simply to put the name of their aunt, Leah Bondi, in the provenance. The museum said, no, we don't do that, you have to talk to the Leopold Foundation. So it got complicated very quickly, and so the family didn't know what to do. Academics, they teach at Princeton, they're not lawyers, and they're not litigants, they're not advocates, they're not looking for money or anything. So essentially it got a little ugly very quickly because MoMA was essentially lawyering up. And they didn't like the idea that somebody could come in and basically tell them what to do and what not to do, because that was essentially, I have the correspondence. It was like it was them talking at us, not talking with us. So we sent another letter saying, why don't we sit down at the table and listen to what the Bondis have to say. And if you think it's without merit, then we stop right there. And MoMA said no. And they said, as a matter of fact, we're creating up the collection and about to ship it to Bilbao, which was the next stop. And they said, if you want to stop the painting, you have to sue us. So that little message comes in late December. And meantime, Judy Dobrinsky writes a huge article in the New York Times, which essentially outlines the problems in the collection. But she also injects something which, I never discussed it with her because I figured, let bygones be bygones. But she suggested that one of the motives for the family to wake up is because the painting was worth $2 million in 1997. So she injected sort of the monetary aspect of this, which is really not very nice, because that's not the motivation. It's not her, it's not their fault that the art market went crazy. Schiele's until 1950, 55, you could buy for lunch, an expensive lunch. They really, works on paper, they were just worth nothing. And it's the Saint Etienne Gallery in New York that essentially built the market almost single-handedly. Jane Collier is the world expert on Egon Schiele. It's thanks to her and her family that essentially created Egon out of nothing. Egon was basically a local flavor until the 50s, but he required the Austrian immigration to New York to create the market for his works. The same thing with Klimt. So that's something else that you have to understand, is that it's the world that we live in here is in part contaminated by art market practices. In other words, the claimants themselves are not responsible for the values given to certain artists. If they happen to own those works and lost them, then everybody wakes up and says, well, why are you're claiming them because they're worth $15 million. Forget about the $320 million that were paid for the Klimts. that were basically Murray Altman's property as a Blochbauer heir. Those numbers are staggering, or so staggering that they're meaningless. But that's not what it's about. It's just about loss. And the discussion about, yes, one second. And the discussion about loss is basically skewed by this question of property, by who holds title. And then this has also come to change the parameters of how art historians do research. Because this whole issue of provenance research used to be the discrete province of art practitioners, which it always should have been. But because history tends to hop in and show its ugly head, the requirement has been now, 20 years later, that you do not ignore history when you research the ownership of these works of art that are in your collection. Yes?
Sorry, I've lost my voice a bit. I want to thank you for making us think about hard things. Really appreciate that. This is really interesting. And I wanted to go back to something you said at the beginning of your talk about ritual objects. And this may be going too far afield, and that's fine. But there are a lot of synagogues here in the States who have what they call Holocaust Torahs. And there was that whole fraud thing years ago. And putting that aside, are there, is bringing those back to congregations in Europe or Jewish communities there, has that been something that has come up in this realm? I haven't heard of it, but I can imagine that as communities have reestablished themselves, if they would want their, their holy objects back.
Well, thanks for raising this. I mean, there have been a number of cases in the U.S. The ones that I remember are from the Frankfurt Jewish community and the Czech community. And these are not, quote unquote, financially, they're not relevant in that sense for the art market, but they are extremely important because they are ritual objects, and they were consisted mostly of textiles. There's been, and this is where the U.S. government again has claimed a major role.
I was going to say also return of the monstrance to a Catholic church that had been looted. Yeah.
So it's there is ritual. There are ritual objects being returned, but it really means that these communities have to be motivated, and a lot of times they're just kind of shy. The Czechs really didn't even want to go to court, so they have to be sort of badgered into it. But it's again this whole idea that they're not here to litigate. They just think that the normal thing to do is to recognize it's looted and just return it. But then when you have people like Michael Steinhardt, who's a major Jewish philanthropist, who put part of his Judaica on sale, then yes, there was a Jewish item there. And excuse my French, but he was a little pissy about it, even though the object was now worth more than a couple $1,000. But it was the idea of returning, and I think this is where we should close. But it's the idea of returning which gets everybody completely upset. So one has to wonder whether the methodology of recovery is wrong-headed, or is it just because the people who own the objects do not want to face the fact that they bought something that they should never have owned. But then you have to ask, where does the responsibility lie? And that's where everybody points a finger at everybody else. The museums blame the market blames the people that they bought from. But in all appearance, it means that nobody's doing their homework and they expect somebody else to do the homework. So the old cliche, when you buy a car, you have to do a title search. When you buy a house, you have to do a title search. But then when you offer a Monet that's worth $1 million to a museum, apparently that's not exactly high on the list. And as far as I know, there are only 2 museums in this country that now have a checklist, an internal checklist. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which has done very good work in recent years, and the Metropolitan Museum, which I found out by chance because we had filed a FOIA at the State Department to try to figure out how these works enter the country and benefit from the culturally significant stamp. And in the process of doing that, we realized that they met the checklist, so they get a gold star. But it's not the same for most museums, and it's a haphazard, very erratic process. So when we have these principles that are going to be discussed in Berlin, these principles were supposed to encourage countries to essentially do research, set up processes at their national level to facilitate restitution, build this registry, which never got built, deal with heirless assets. Nobody really knows what heirless assets mean. I mean, to me, every asset has an owner. So when do you declare it to be heirless? And that's really something that my fellow Jewish members of organizations, are very adamant about not responding to that because it means that you stop doing research. And when you stop doing research, then it becomes airless. So it's a complete fiction. It's just it's an intention. Because it's easier to call it airless and then to sell it than to basically look for the art. That's all it's about. I don't want to be callous because, of course, every object is very different. And the more further east you go in terms of the thefts, the harder it is to do the research. So I understand that perfectly, but let's just be clear about the definitions. So you have the airless assets, which are everywhere, and we discover them every day. You can go to a flea market, you'll find them. I found some in Annandale, in an antique market. So you never know where it ends up because it comes with a person. You see, the stuff doesn't walk out by itself. It leaves with a person. It leaves the studio, it goes to a gallery, or it's stolen. It's very simple. So at some point, the chain breaks. And you never want it to break, but it breaks at one point. And then it has to be put back together. If it's broken during the context of genocide, then it's going to take forever to put that chain back together. It's not complicated, but our system complicates the story because, frankly, we don't want to tell that story. The art market is a $65 billion a year beast. 30 or 32 billion, doesn't matter, 1 billion up or down, pertains to objects produced before 1945. I want you to sort of digest that, which means that $35 billion worth of cultural material is either not provenance inadequately, or even if it is provenance properly, whether it's looted or not, changes hands globally. How do you fight that juggernaut? How do you tell these people to be ethical? Because it is business-wise, it is profitable to sell this stuff because there's nobody coming to beat you over the head to say, don't sell it because it's stolen property. And who cares, it happened 70 years ago. But tell that to the people in the Balkans who lost their art 20 years ago during that horrible event. It's the same thing. And I hear every day, from down there that their art is recirculating in Croatia, Serbia, even Austria, and going into international markets without anybody having a clue as to what they're selling. So the Washington principles are not the answer because they are non-binding. They're just simply suggestions, just like the museum associations provide guidelines. Remember the Pirates of the Caribbean? It's just a guideline. So you don't have to listen. The Dutch government has recently put forth a law that says now it's a balance of equity issue. If the museum's collection loses its cohesiveness because it has to restitute something, the museum's interests prime over those of the claimant. They invoke the Washington principles to do that. The Leopold Foundation in Vienna, when it seeks a financial settlement, invokes the Washington principles. And the heinous expression is just and fair solutions. That is not something that claimants came up with. That is something that current possessors came up with. And since most of the signatories of the Washington principles have state cultural institutions where once the object enters, it does not leave. The Italians have been petitioned for the last 20 years to return a painting in Milan. They refused to, and the only reason why one of them was returned to its rightful owner is because the Italians forgot to immunize the object when it came to Tallahassee. No immunity, it's open for seizure. And thanks to our law enforcement people and to our Justice Department people, the object was seized because the claim had been around for 20 years. The other painting is still sitting at that museum, the Pinacoteca de Brea, whatever. That is, it's a beautiful place from what I hear, old masters galore. But there's one painting there that they refused to return, even though the other one was restituted. How do you explain that? It's about state cultural property. It's about the way that governments interpret who owns what. Until that question gets addressed, we're not going to get anywhere. The Russians are sitting on who knows how many objects that they took as compensation for their losses. Part of me says, I don't blame them. They lost a third of their adult male population. Their entire Western infrastructure was completely vaporized. their demographic evolution was stunted for 2 generations because there were no available men. So yes, they were shocked, traumatized, but unfortunately, we're paying for it. Held hostage are all those unknown works of art sitting in every single museum in what used to be the Soviet Union, in cellars, in churches, in all sorts of places. The Russians are not doing anything with it, they're just using it as a ghostly reminder of what once was. If you ever saw The Rape of Europa, there's a scene, which is probably the best scene in the film, where the Minister of Culture points to the mass graves in Leningrad and says, you know why we're not returning anything? It's because of that. So come back 20 years later and we can talk about it. Well, 20 years are up. So who knows? Yes?
I believe that's how you've answered the question of where are we now, which is the question that you said you would address during your talk today.
Well, I'm glad I did my job.
Would you join me in thanking Marc for coming?